Welcome to the U.S. Manufacturing Today podcast, your hub of information about the U.S. manufacturing and distribution industry. Brought to you by Variable, the on-demand labor solution revitalizing and optimizing your operation, enabling just-in-time response to demand, more efficient production, and lower cost per unit. And now your host and head of Reindustrialization at Variable, Matt Horine.
Welcome to U.S. Manufacturing Today, the podcast powered by Variable, where we talk with the leaders, innovators, and changemakers shaping the future of American industry, along with providing regular updates on the state of manufacturing, the changing landscape, policies, and more. Today's guest is Scott Maier, CEO of Blue Star NBR, a Virginia-based manufacturer working to rebuild one of the most critical and overlooked segments of the U.S. industrial base, domestic nitrile glove production. In the wake of the pandemic shortages and growing geopolitical risk, Scott has emerged as a leading voice on the national security implications of relying on foreign countries for essential medical supplies. His work sits at the intersection of manufacturing, policy, and preparedness, highlighting how deeply the healthcare supply chain is tied to America's industrial strength. Scott has written and spoken extensively about supply chain vulnerabilities, the realities of competing with foreign state-backed producers, and the urgent need to restore domestic capability. Today's conversation focuses on what it actually takes to rebuild this sector, why it matters far beyond healthcare, and how medical manufacturing connects directly to the broader reindustrialization movement happening across the U.S. Scott, welcome to U.S. Manufacturing Today.
Now, pleasure to be here.
We're excited to have you on today because I think this is a really critical, important issue. I've followed you for some time on X now. You've written about it pretty extensively, so looking forward to bringing this to our audience. But first and foremost, can you start by sharing your background a little bit and what led you into manufacturing in the first place?
Sure. So I like to think of myself as a kind of former, finance person, rehabilitated myself into manufacturing and actually doing something that can, create a lot of jobs and bring these critical industries back. I spent the first 15 years of my career in various venture capital and private equity funds. The first 7 were kind of in the funds. Then the next 8 years was more working alongside them doing turnaround work. And that's where I really, got a taste of the kind of, operational roles and, being able to fix companies that weren't performing well and getting them back on track and being able to save jobs. So really enjoy that aspect of it. And then in 2015, started my first company, Bird Dog Distributors, which was a medical and surgical supply distribution company. We then purchased a plastics manufacturing company in 2016 that was focused on medical items, kind of medical waste carts and dolly hampers for burn boxes. Also do some like industrial dunnage bins. Started a cut and sew shop in 2020. And then our big project is bringing back these critical nitrile gloves.
Now that's a pretty interesting path back to it, because maybe you've defined the moment, or if you could define the moment, what made you realize the U.S. had such a serious vulnerability in medical supply production?
Yeah, it really started in 2015 when I started my company, just realizing how much of these, critical medical consumables we were importing. And then in 2019, I got linked with a group that was trying to bring one of these glove manufacturing facilities back to the U.S. and seeing, at the time it was Malaysia was our largest supplier. And, typically it was the forced labor issues with Malaysia where, every quarter, one of the top 10 producers would get put in the penalty box by CPB. And, the buyers just had a heck of a time trying to, have the balance of keeping inventory, long supply chain, and then, hey, who is going to be put in the penalty box this quarter for the forced labor practice issue?
Right. And so, during the pandemic, we all saw headlines about shortages. From your vantage point, what was really going on behind the scenes with that?
Yeah, I mean, it was, the U.S. consumes 1/3 of the world's glove production. So we've had these best practices, kind of baked into our standard operating procedures for a long time now. And then when the pandemic happened, every other country in the world started to, kind of put these best practices in place as well. So you weren't kind of, spreading germs. And again, here in the United States, a doctor or nurse can't touch you without a glove on. And in a pandemic environment, the glove usage for the healthcare sector, it basically tripled. So, everyone kind of associates gloves with doctors and nurses, but typically it's only about 30% of our use here in the States. 50 to 60% goes to industrial. But, when you have a pandemic type environment, now all of a sudden the healthcare industry, kind of triples and, goes from about 40 billion gloves a year to 120. And then every other country in the world was also demanding a lot more gloves. And of course, we had pretty much zero production here. So, just couldn't make them.
Right. It probably highlighted one of the most critical supply chain shortages, or, from our perspective, I think you and I share the same viewpoint, just a critical manufacturing shortages. There's something really unique about your firm and your approach. And, if we could help our audience understand, what does it actually take to stand up nitrile glove manufacturing in the United States from a capital, workforce, and operational perspective?
Yeah. And this is one of those industries where, the product itself is considered a commodity, but again, with advanced manufacturing, we can make the commodity here at, pretty much a cost competitive price against other nations, except for China. China is its own, kind of island price wise. And, I think it's Craig Tyndall likes to say, they have state capitalism, we have stateless capitalism. And it's, the quote unquote China price is just unique. But, again, to make this, 4-cent glove, it takes about a $200 million facility, which would, output about 3 to 4 billion gloves a year. But again, to get the economies of scale with this, you've really got to have about kind of 8 to 10 billion units of production to, hit that critical scale and be able to compete with, those large producers in the Far East. So, again, for this simple item, you're looking at an investment of almost, $1 billion to really, get the size, scale, and, have enough quantities of gloves to really compete in the marketplace.
Right. There's a lot of misconceptions about, how easy or difficult it is to stand up this kind of manufacturing. We see it all across the manufacturing space talking about reindustrialization, but what are some of the biggest misconceptions people had about bringing PPE manufacturing back on shore?
Yeah, I think, especially with gloves, it's a lot more complicated. So it's not just as simple as, we buy a machine, we put in the, NBR, which is a synthetic rubber, hit the button that starts, and, all of a sudden you're going to spit out gloves. It's, combination of art and science. It's almost like, setting up a new bakery. You've got to figure out, your humidity levels and, all these other weird factors that go to, get a glove that's going to meet the quality requirements for a regulated medical device. And, a lot of the companies that were already producing gloves here were really focusing on specialty gloves, kind of thicker gloves for very specific applications, not the, huge mass produced, doing tens of thousands of gloves an hour type thing. So it's a pretty steep learning curve. And again, like any other industry, the nitrile glove was invented in the United States. In the late 90s, early 2000s, all the production moved overseas because of the labor arbitrage. And again, you just kind of lose that in, institutional knowledge of how to do it.
It really highlights the strategic risk overall in medical supply chain and people's just misconception that it's easy to bring back on shore and something that can just be at the snap of a finger. You said something pretty interesting there. When people hear nitrile gloves, they may think of a commodity product. Turning a little bit to the industrial side, why is this actually such a strategic manufacturing capability?
Yeah. And, again, most people associate it with the healthcare industry, but again, that's only about 30% of where they're used. It's, kind of 50 to 60% is your industrial manufacturing. So, think of your semiconductor factories, pharmaceutical, APIs, rare earths. You can't process or refine rare earths without wearing nitrile gloves. The new industrial magnets, same issue. You've got to have gloves because they have a lot of rare earths in them. Your lithium battery production, you have to wear gloves. So all of these critical industries that we're bringing back on shore, all these factories cannot operate without the workers wearing gloves. And again, this is something that China, realized was a strategic item. And from 2020 to 2022, they built 100 billion units of glove manufacturing capacity. And even more importantly, they actually overtook the raw material market. So making the synthetic rubber, the nitrile butadiene rubber, NBR as we call it. So they made the other glove making nations dependent on them. So, China's buying sanctioned oil. The main components of NBR are acrylonitrile and butadiene, which is a, C4 oil and gas derivative. So they have a huge pricing advantage when you're buying oil at, $30 a barrel. Now they get these, they start producing gloves at a, rock bottom price. All the other countries need to try and follow suit. The only way they can do that is by purchasing the raw material from China. So now, whether it's the finished glove or the raw material, China now controls, 90% of our market. And unfortunately, we didn't really learn much during the pandemic because in 2020, we were importing 99% of our needs. And here we are, 6 years later, we're still importing 99% of our needs. And China now controls 90% of it.
Yeah, it's a heavy concentration and kind of a weaponized vertical integration. If you think about it, there's really nowhere left to turn unless this becomes a high center of focus and, from industrial policy's perspective. From your perspective, should PPE be viewed as part of a national security infrastructure and how can we take steps to do that?
Yeah, I think it absolutely should be. Again, especially as we're spending, hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars to bring, these semiconductor factories, these pharmaceutical factories back. I mean, again, it's China's kind of unrestricted asymmetric warfare. It's like, hey, great, build a, $200 billion chip fab and have fun running it when we don't send you clean room gloves. Oh, okay. You want to make your own pharmaceuticals now? Great. Same issue. Have fun running it when we don't send you clean room gloves. Oh, you're starting to figure out rare earths and, industrial magnets. Great. Have fun when we don't send you industrial nitrile gloves. I mean, China is very good about finding these, kind of key strategic sectors and then just, making themselves a, almost monopoly and strategic choke point of it. So even if you do try to bring back your own production, they still have, other levers within that, critical, supply chain vertical that they can, turn off and scuttle your efforts.
Yeah, they've done that on a number of fronts, and people often think that reindustrializing means just standing something up or standing up a factory. And like you said, critical choke point on the most basic tools and equipment that go into any factory, not just, in this vertical, but across the board. I think one of the broader themes that we've seen and is a recurring theme on the show, how does this conversation connect to broader concerns about supply chain resilience and sovereignty? We've seen the theme of economic sovereignty, come up again and again, and it seems like it's coming to a ramp and probably the topic of the day, at least for 2026. But do you see it connecting to that broader conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think, what this administration, realizes and is trying to rectify is, we can't defend our freedom if we can't make the tools needed, to defend it. And again, I think when, kind of DOW started looking at, their kind of supply chain and realizing that, there's that, chart that's kind of all there on X of, kind of the primes, and it goes down to your tier 2s, but then all of a sudden your tier 3 and tier 4 all has a critical China link somewhere in it. And again, I don't think anyone realized it was quite that bad, but in reality it is. And again, how do we, tear ourselves away from this so we have enough of an industrial base here in the United States that we're not reliant on China for any of these critical things?
Right. You've written extensively about the policy environment surrounding this, and particularly as it relates to economic sovereignty and reindustrialization and medical manufacturing. Where do you think policymakers misunderstand the reality on the ground versus more of like the abstract academic theory?
It all needs to be interconnected. So you basically have to have, kind of policy to protect the domestic market. So that can be through your tariffs. Again, there's some uncertainty there with the IEEPA. I know there's a bunch of 232 reviews going on, but again, until investors see that, there's some kind of certainty there, they're a little bit shaky of really going all in on reindustrialization. But, again, we've got to tie all these things together. So you have to have your, tariff protections. There's got to be financing available for these companies, especially for the greenfield industries that just don't exist, right? Again, for nitrile gloves, we had such a small base. There really wasn't, a couple of large companies that, we could have gone to and said, hey, we really need you to expand production. So it was entrepreneurs like myself and a bunch of others that, kind of stood up during the pandemic to try and do these complex projects. And then it's the kind of commitment from the buyers to say, yeah, we are going to support this resiliency, especially on the medical side. Hospitals are extremely price sensitive. And, again, when the prices went through the roof, they complained. And then, China came in and everything crashed down, which, made it impossible for the domestic producers to be viable. But, for the hospitals, having a, penny or half penny difference is a big deal for them. But again, there's a trade-off. Do you want to have resiliency or do you want to be dependent on the foreign supply? And, there's got to be a balance there.
Yeah, the balance seems hard to strike. And I think tariffs have been an interesting tool or a lever that the administration has pulled, but it's also uncovered, I think what the theme is a lack of reciprocity, meaning, there are these trade advantages that certain nations have, particularly when they're adversarial. How difficult is it for U.S. manufacturers to compete against imported products, particularly when those products are subsidized? And we've seen that, in things that you don't even think of, like Canadian lumber. That was something I had no idea was so heavily subsidized by the Canadian government. And I've, found out it essentially killed a lot of the lumber industry in the United States. But where do you see some of those flashpoints?
Yeah. And again, I think, there really is no true free market in the globalization, right? I think, every country has specific industries that they, for whatever reason, decided they wanted to go all in on. And like you said, there's various subsidies there, right? Like, for Taiwan, there's nothing special in the soil in Taiwan that makes them a semiconductor manufacturing powerhouse. The Taiwanese government decided, this was the sector they were going to go all in on. And that's what ended up happening. China was very strategic of just going up and down the vertical supply chain from mining to refining to basic manufacturing and then slowly work their way up. But again, having access to that vertical supply chain and having, all of those raw inputs made on, the Chinese continent gives them a huge advantage. Advanced manufacturing, the labor arbitrage isn't the primary cost driver. In today's manufacturing, labor arbitrage with like a 50%, kind of difference in wages might account for 8 to 10% of a product's final price. It's really the raw inputs that are driving things. And again, talking to a lot of the buyers, you talked about, hitting that balance. If the US market can come within that 8 to 10%, pricing difference, they'd rather have domestic to kind of cut out the complexity of that supply chain.
Right. You said something really important there, and I think that's been highlighted by past guests on our part. The preference is generally 100% for local if it's viable, right? And that's something that we've seen, and people are trying to figure out this complex puzzle to make that the option, as close to 100% of the time as you can get. You hit on something pretty interesting, specifically about the healthcare market, because they operate on a pretty tight margin, on a pretty tight profitability margin. Tariffs on their own are doing what they're doing, but does domestic manufacturing require longer term procurement commitments to really survive? And you said, back in the pandemic timeframe, you were looking at those types of commitments, but do you think that's where the market's heading?
I think eventually it will. Again, I think this administration realizes that, especially for these greenfield industries, that, again, to attract the private capital, you've got to have the offtake commitments. So I think we've seen that, especially in the rare earths, where, DOW and some of the other, like the auto manufacturers all kind of come in and, guarantee that they'll offtake what these domestic manufacturers are going to produce. Secretary Lutnick was in an event a couple of weeks ago and mentioned that, this whole thing started, when the auto manufacturers came to the administration and they said, hey, we've got a major issue here. We need these industrial magnets. It's about $20 of the cost of a vehicle, but now China is saying, we're not going to sell them to you anymore. And this was, again, it was a commodity type item. They said, China used to sell them by the bagful, they sold them by the kilo. And then they decided to weaponize it. And it was like, oh man, we can't make our, $40,000 car because we don't have this $20 magnet.
Yeah, it's so critical choke points are something else, because you think about entire industries and the stories that we've heard over the past, not only just recently because of tariffs, but for decades, textiles or auto manufacturing or, whatever the case may be, they were hollowed out, first from the labor arbitrage standpoint and then from raw materials, which is certainly seems like this applies in the medical space as well, which is actually, the biggest employer in the country, or at least like the biggest growing sector. So it's a warning light for sure. Do you see parallels between what's happened in medical supply chains and what's happening in other industries like semiconductors, casting, machine tools, some of those real industrial sectors?
Yeah, I think it's starting. Again, Secretary Lutnick mentioned, I think there's about 400 billion of kind of pharmaceutical factories and APIs and KSMs, the key starting materials, manufacturing facilities that are going to be built in the United States. So, again, I think everyone's now realizing, having China control between 50 to 90% of our medical supply chain between PPE, medical consumables, and drugs, whether it's, a finished drug or an API, which is basically a raw material for a pharmaceutical, again, is not a great place. Like we said, this is another sector and supply chain that China can weaponize. And, again, what keeps me up at night is China can shut down our healthcare system in about 45 days if they say, yeah, we're just not going to send this stuff anymore.
That's really a terrifying prospect because I think that can happen on a lot of fronts, but healthcare is probably the most concerning out of all of them. You hear about things in the consumer market. I think you probably recall right at the launch of Liberation Day and when tariffs were just kicking off, it was very consumer focused when people were worried about where they were going to get their Corona beer or avocados, which was not necessarily serious industrial policy. That's consumer preference, not, critical manufacturing. Talking more about onshoring and some of the demand signals that you've seen, are organizations heading in the direction of prioritizing price over supply chain security? You work in a critical sector. Do you hear that conversation more often? Is that something that's trending or just something you define as needs to happen?
Yeah, I think it's trending. I think it needs to happen in other industries. Again, I think healthcare is one where, I think the administration is, working on some levers to kind of force the industry's hand. There's a recent proposal by CMS, which is, kind of controls Medicare and Medicaid, about having higher reimbursements for hospitals that purchase domestic PPE and then having kind of a bonus payment if they hit a certain threshold. So they're trying to figure out some incentives to, again, prioritize the domestic industry and, again, give some incentives to really support it in a meaningful way, not just, we'll buy some gloves here and there or we'll buy a couple of masks here and there, but to have a decent chunk of their supply chain come from domestic sources. I think the other thing that'll happen too is as these, kind of semiconductor and the pharmaceutical facilities come back, they'll definitely prioritize a domestic product because, again, as the total, cost of, their production, it's extremely minimal. So having a slightly higher glove, coming from a US source is, it's trivial versus, having to contemplate, we might have to shut down production because we can't get gloves.
Right. That's a really interesting problem that just kind of keeps coming up from the perspective of people are talking about investment. They're investing or they're creating X amount of jobs or they're doing things that will create, X size facility from a square footage standpoint or bring a certain amount of jobs to a certain place, which it's not necessarily the lever to pull anymore, but workforce is certainly a challenge that's been highlighted before. What role do workforce development and industrial skills play in rebuilding this capability? And you have your factory is located in Virginia and Appalachia. Would love to hear more about where you kind of site selected and where you're building.
Yeah, and workforce is a huge component of any of these facilities. And again, the kind of all the projects we do, we try to bring to kind of the Southwest Virginia area, Appalachia. It's old coal mining country, and just, kind of region that's just been devastated for decades. And again, whatever project we can, we try to bring back there. We have great support from the Commonwealth and from the county. And what we've done is kind of partner with Virginia and the local community college. So Virginia has something called the Talent Accelerator Program, which, has budget from Virginia. So they'll give money to the community college to develop a training program specific for our factory. So basically any student can go through it free of cost to them. And, they would have a guaranteed job at Blue Star once they complete it. So I think there's a lot of that can be done on the local level where these facilities are coming up to work with, kind of the community college or the local, trade college. Or even high schools, let's get these shop classes back, right? Let's get kids working with their hands again and see, what is possible in these new modern factories, right? This isn't the old factory where, you go in and, work in a super hot environment or something and, come out and, you've got, grease everywhere. These aren't those kind of facilities.
It's taken its toll on the manufacturing sector, and people actually tend to think if you're trying to bring manufacturing back, you're trying to bring manufacturing back the way that it was. And that's certainly not the case because everything moves forward. And I think we're probably in what we would call an industrializing society because I think we had a mutual friend who said really well, anything that's post-industrial and reindustrializing is actually pre-industrial because it's bringing the next wave. John Gardner from Manufacturer Local had written that. So it's a really interesting thing because it does come up. People think that's exactly where you're going and it's not. And, one other thing to really highlight there is that all manufacturing is local. We talk about it from a national security standpoint. It's super important, the investment in the policymakers. But if local areas are not investing in that type of talent and workforce, it's just not going to happen. Being from that part of the country, and it's just of interest, what are some of the implication that you've seen or is there a general trend heading back towards manufacturing? Outside of just those programs, but do you see that in the Carolinas where textiles were once the biggest employer or parts of the country where manufacturing was so big before.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs that are kind of looking at all of these industries that went away. You've got Kaya Rhodes, whose company Anatar, she's working with robotics to, again, kind of bring this next wave of, textile manufacturing back. Our little cut and sew shop in Honecker, Virginia, we do tactical nylon. So we make, kind of plate carriers and magazine pouches, things like that. Again, we've done a lot of automation to work with our, kind of limited workforce to increase productivity. I mean, again, that's what advanced manufacturing is all about. It's not really replacing workers. It's just increasing their output. It's kind of, giving them superpowers is how we view it. It's like, hey, all right, this little, kind of clamp lets you do 50 pieces an hour versus, 10 doing it the other way. And, that's what we focus on.
Yeah, no, the productivity increase is certainly something to behold. I think it actually was Kaya, who I follow on X, who had talked about, the textile industry coming back in a way that, what used to take 10 workers now takes one worker, and they're basically making the same wage. So you've restored the wage rate, but you've also done it in a way that increases productivity significantly. So that's a pretty exciting development.
And again, yeah, for textiles, it's all about, automating the kind of mundane tasks and then leaving the higher, as what we do at our facility, kind of the basic things we automate and then leave the, kind of higher, skilled things to the actual sewers. Cause, some things are just complex because, it's 3-dimensional and you can't really automate them. But again, if we can get a solution that gets us, 50, 60, 70% there, and then that last half or, 30%, is done by the worker, again, it's a huge productivity gain. And that's what allows us to bring this manufacturing back.
Yeah, really great point. And, this is the part of the podcast where we kind of ask you to look into the future. That is the future, increasing that productivity and bringing that back. It's all part of this bigger puzzle. But if you were to look 5 to 10 years down the road, what does success look like for domestic medical manufacturing?
What was originally envisioned was having a kind of 25% to 35% safety valve of all our products manufactured locally, domestically here in the US. That way, again, if there is another supply chain hiccup, we're not, out of a product, right? We have enough, kind of domestic manufacturing to kind of let us limp along while we then decide, okay, do we expand our domestic production or do we think things will, settle down and go back to normal? But, we just never want to be at the situation where we're dependent on one region or one nation for 90% of our needs. I mean, Marco Rubio mentioned that at the Munich conference, just the other day. He said, it's absurd that, we would ever allow ourselves to become dependent for critical items, on one region or one nation.
Right. No, that's kind of critical to civilizational survival or, your viewpoint on the way the world works. You mentioned it a little earlier in the show, but what keeps you up at night when you think about the future of this sector?
Again, that it doesn't get the foothold and really be able to, take off, right? I think the prime example is nitrile gloves, right? We went through a pandemic. We saw what happened when we don't have them. We kind of made a half-hearted effort to try and reshore it, but it wasn't fully supported by, this prior administration. And, I just don't want to see that happen again, where we have renewed interest. It starts to gain a little bit of traction, but then it peters out. But again, I think this new the Trump administration is committed to really making sure that we end all of these, dependencies on these critical products.
On the reverse side of that, you're an entrepreneur, you're a pretty generally optimistic guy, and you've identified a critical, threshold that we need to surpass here. What gives you the most optimism about the environment right now?
I think just the way it's trending. I think, as more, again, manufacturing leads to more manufacturing. So I think if we have more semiconductor facilities, more pharmaceutical facilities coming back, that increases demand. And again, I think once our, glove industry really starts to hit that economies of scale, then the healthcare market, I think, will come because we'll be able to have, a much more competitive price than we do now. And again, I think, then they'll kind of scale and say, all right, yeah, we're going to dedicate 30, 40, maybe even 50% of our supply chain to make sure it's resilient.
Because you're in the space and you've stood up this facility and this business, what advice would you give to entrepreneurs or operators who are thinking about entering the space for critical manufacturing in the United States?
Yeah, I would say, definitely get some operating experience, depending where you currently are working, definitely, go to a manufacturing facility, hop on a production line, work with an engineer, work on that machine tool, kind of get to know those people on the floor, because, that's the whole, heart and soul of your operation there. And, really get a feel for what that's like. I think any successful manufacturing company, those workers are the key to it. And, you've got to be able to, work with them, understand, what they need. Program we did at, my company in the plastic manufacturing is every other Friday, the employees get, basically a half day to take any process that they don't like doing and figuring out a better way to do it. And they've come up with some, just really innovative solutions to things.
And that's a testament to the spirit of manufacturing. Sometimes the answer is sitting right in front of you when you're trying to, solve, reinvent the wheel, in some cases, literally. And, the people who are on the shop floor every day usually come up with that innovation. So it's really good perspective to have.
Yeah. I mean, basically, you've got to view your R&D not as an expense, but as an investment in future productivity.
We highlighted it. I think you wrote a great piece in the Journal of Political Risk recently on, what you're doing. What message would you want policymakers and the public to understand about why rebuilding this capacity matters and what they can do to help you on your mission?
Yeah, I think, again, try and support the local manufacturers as much as you can, support buying from, domestic manufacturers. And on the policy side, again, it's got to be this holistic approach, right? I think, we talk about industrial policy or industrial strategy, as we like to call it. And again, we've got to have all these pieces kind of working at the same time. We can't just say, oh, we're just going to do tariffs, but then not look at, financing solutions, or say, well, we're just going to provide financing, but then not protect the domestic market once it's built. So, it's a balancing act, but, they've all got to go, intertwined to make sure it's going to be successful for the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's next for Blue Star NBR, and where can our listeners find out more about you?
Yeah, we're, again, working to kind of get our finishing funds to get the raw material facility completed and then start building the first of 6 glove manufacturing facilities. The website is just a placeholder. It's Blue Star NBR. Then, most of my stuff is on X, which is under my name at Scott, middle initial T, Maier, Maier. So pretty much talk about gloves all the time, but, that's my passion right now. And again, they think the National Security Council said, we're a strategic enabler for all of this manufacturing that's coming back. So just want to make sure that, again, the rare earth people and the magnets and the pharmaceuticals all have the required gloves they need to, make these other critical items.
Scott, thank you very much for coming on. I learned a ton about this today and, how critical this is to it. And if you're listening, Scott has an excellent follow on X, so be sure to look him up and we'll be sure to link it into the comments. But thank you for coming on again today.
Yeah, no, appreciate it.
To stay ahead of the curve and to help plan your strategy, please check out our website at variableops.com and under the resources section titled Trump 2.0, where you can see the framework around upcoming policies and how they will impact you as a manufacturer. If you're on socials, give us a follow on LinkedIn, X, Truth, or Instagram. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please feel free to follow the show on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube and leave us a rating, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you again for joining us and learning more about how you can make your way.